for some 600 years, eventually introducing Christianity to the area. Some of their many great works of engineering, such as the aqueducts and amphitheater of Merida and the Bridge of Cordoba, still stand today. The Latin language, which the Romans introduced, eventually became the basis for modern Spanish. But in the 5th century CE, the Romans were in their turn conquered, this time by the Visigoths from Germany. Meanwhile, events in far distant Arabia were creating a whirlwind that would affect the Iberian Peninsula forever. For centuries, the nomadic Bedouin tribes there had been pagans. Competition for survival in their harsh desert environment had involved them in endless blood feuds. In 610 CE, however, in the Arabian city of Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad founded the new religion of Islam, whose followers were known as Muslims. He preached that instead of worshipping many gods, Muslims had to submit to just one God, Allah. This new idea took fierce hold among the Bedouins and helped to unite them in their achievement of one goal, the spread of Islam over the known world. Muslim armies ranged in all directions. Within 100 years, the Muslim empire stretched from the western regions of India across Persia, Arabia, and Egypt, and along the North African coast to include the modern nations of Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, just 8 miles away from the Iberian shore. During this period, the Visigoths' rule of the Iberian Peninsula had broken down into chaos, with individual families fighting for power. In 711 CE, a claimant to the throne asked the Moroccan Muslims, whom the Christians called Moors, to help him overthrow the Visigothic king. Led by the governor of Tangiers, who saw an excellent opportunity to further the cause of Islam, the Moors eagerly crossed the narrow strait of Gibraltar to reach Al-Andalus, their name for the peninsula. But they did not stop there. Iberia fell easy prey to their onrushing armies, which took a mere 7 years to subjugate the peninsula as far north as the Ebro River. The Moors were to remain for nearly 800 years. Their influence, more than that of any other invaders, would indelibly mark Spanish culture for centuries to come. In stark contrast to the Moors' desert homelands, southern Spain, or Andalusia as it came to be known, offered them a green and fertile paradise. In a short time, the city of Cordoba was established as the Moorish capital. Along with Islam, the Muslims brought a highly advanced civilization to their new home. Arab scholars had preserved learned writings from ancient Greece, Rome, and the Middle East, and Muslims were making great strides in architecture, mathematics, medicine, and science. They were also excellent farmers, artisans, and traders. Moorish goods such as glass, paper, leather, metalwork, and silk were renowned as far away as India. By the 9th century, the city of Cordoba had exploded into a metropolis of 500,000 citizens and boasted some 800 mosques, a university where science, medicine, and philosophy flourished, and a library that held 4,000 volumes. In the 13th century, the province of Granada became the main Muslim kingdom, dominated by the magnificent Alhambra Palace in the capital city, also called Granada. The Moorish influence in Spain was so strong that many Christians became Muslims and even made the traditional pilgrimage to Mecca, the holiest city of Islam. Muslim architecture dominated many cities. There were even brief periods of peaceful interaction between Christians and Muslims. But the majority of Christians saw Islam as the dark enemy of their faith. They also feared new invasions of Moors from North Africa and never lost their determination to recapture southern Spain from the Muslims. From the start, the more powerful northern provinces that had escaped Moorish domination led successful raids against the Muslims. Little by little, they pushed and Spain was no exception. When the Moors arrived, the Jews hoped for better times, for Jews and Muslims shared a long history. They had inhabited the same territories in the Middle East and North Africa for centuries and had much in common. Despite periods of anti-Semitism in Muslim regions, the Jews had long engaged in an exchange of learning with the Muslims. They even wrote Arabic using Hebrew characters. Under the Moors in Spain, their culture entered a golden age of literature and philosophy, and they enjoyed a brief freedom from the persecution that had hounded them for centuries. They remained, however, a separate and mysterious culture to the Christians. Embroiled in its own problems, Christian Iberia had long been poor. Then quite suddenly, as though a magic spell had been cast, Spain emerged in the late 15th century as the most powerful nation in the world. By this time, Castile had become the dominant kingdom. It was now identified by the rest of Europe as Spain, and its language as Spanish. By the mid-1500s, it would rule an empire that extended from Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands to the Caribbean, Florida, Mexico, Central America, and parts of South America. Untold wealth in silver and gold would flow into Spanish coffers, while Spanish arts and letters would flourish as never before. The catalyst that catapulted Spain into this sudden prominence was the marriage of Princess Isabel of Castile and Prince Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469. They were a supremely gifted couple with extraordinary political skills. Together they forged the unification of Castile and Aragon, setting the stage for a great empire and paving the way for the modern nation of Spain. They are especially noted for the events of 1492. In this year, the monarchs finally drove out the Moors from Granada and sent Christopher Columbus on his monumental journey into the unknown. They were also responsible for the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition, in which thousands of people who did not follow the sovereign's rigid Catholicism were tortured or killed. In 1492, they ordered the expulsion of all Jews from Spain. In this book, you will learn about Isabel and Ferdinand's extraordinary reign. You will discover how the Spanish people lived and thought during that time, and through their letters, edicts, chronicles, ballads, and poems, you'll experience firsthand the words of these powerful rulers and their subjects. Ignore that last sentence, we're not doing that part. Chapter 1, or Part 1, the one as much as the other. Isabel of Castile, the princess. Isabel came from a long line of Catholic kings and queens who firmly believed that royalty was a God-given gift. The position of queen came with unrestricted privilege as well as a strong sense of duty. Born in 1451, Isabel spent her early years at Arevalo, a market town in the heart of the Castilian Meseta. Her mother became depressed, or some say mad, soon after Isabel's birth, and locked herself away in a dark room of their castle. When Isabel was 3, her father, King Juan II, died, and her half-brother, Enrique IV, became king. He visited Arevalo frequently and kept a close eye on Isabel and her younger brother, Alfonso. But it was mainly Isabel's grandmother, Isabel de Barcelos, who ran the household. This formidable woman was of royal Portuguese stock and certainly impressed the young Isabel with her quality of no-nonsense regal authority. While growing up, Isabel had also been exposed to various heroes and heroines of history. Castilians were a hardy breed of people who had to be tough to weather the blistering summers and icy winters of their Meseta. So it is not surprising that they revered the great Roman emperors Hadrian and Trajan, who were born in Spain. Isabel's father had also greatly admired Joan of Arc. This famous 15th century heroine was only 17 when she led French troops to victory against the English. She was later burned at the stake as a heretic. The Castilian warrior Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, known as El Cid, had led the struggle against the Moors in the 11th century, and was often held up as a role model for the Castilian character. Isabel would also have heard tales of glory soldiers or conquistadors who guarded the castle. There are ballads and legends told of brave deeds in the Spanish Civil Wars in northern Africa, the Canary Islands, and Portugal. It was from them, perhaps, that Isabel heard tales of fabulous African kingdoms rich in gold, of slaves, of strange new lands with exotic names. It was a time of new frontiers as the adventurous Castilians looked to expand their territories to the south, in Africa, and to the north in Europe. Many of these soldiers had spent their lives fighting in the Reconquista, which had gone on for so long that fighting had become a Castilian way of life. So, like all other Castilians of the time, Isabel naturally accepted war and glorified warriors. Thus, although Isabel was taught womanly skills such as sewing and singing, she also absorbed the values of these strong men and women who played leading roles in her life. She later became known for her strength of will and extraordinary self-control. Hernando de Bulgar, Isabel's secretary when she was queen, recorded that even in childbirth, she was able to mask her feelings and betray not a sign or expression of the pain which all women suffer. It is also recorded that she enjoyed hunting and once killed a savage bear with her own javelin. Europe at the time was steeped in the religious fervor of Christianity. Isabel's grandmother, Isabel de Barcelos, was a devout Catholic who often made pilgrimages in her bare feet to certain shrines. Her young ward was an intelligent, well-read woman whose life revolved entirely around her faith. Princess Isabel's days were marked by the chiming of church bells, the strictly held periods of prayer, and the annual cycle of holy days and feasts. As an adult, she would outdo her grandmother in religious matters and would in fact become known in history as the Catholic Queen, the most devout of all. Ferdinand of Aragon, the Prince. Ferdinand was born in 1452 in the town of Sos in Aragon. From the first, his mother raised him to be a king and an exemplary Catholic. She even postponed his baptism for nearly a year, waiting until the infant's succession to the throne could not be questioned. Then the baptismal ceremony was held in the great cathedral at Zaragoza, with all the pomp and ceremony the kingdom could muster. While Castile was landlocked and rather isolated, Aragon was directly in touch with the Mediterranean world. Along its coastline, ports such as Barcelona and Valencia thrived. From them, an extensive network of overseas trading connections linked Aragon with France, Italy, Greece, and North Africa. As a child, Ferdinand would have been exposed to the many different peoples and wares coming and going from these ports. Perhaps these early influences helped to develop his later flair for international politics. Twice, Ferdinand had been very ill as a child, but as a youth he was immensely strong and healthy. Unlike most children of the time, he was taught to read and write, and from the age of 10 had commanded his own staff of retainers and soldiers. Like all young knights, he had been rigorously trained in horsemanship and weaponry. He loved to joust and also to gamble. While he was not an intellectual, he was curious about everything and always eager to learn. Poetry, lectures, and stories served to instruct Ferdinand in the morals and religious principles of the time. Prince Ferdinand was a good-looking young man. It is said that he had so singular a grace that everyone who talked to him wanted to serve him. As he grew older, he proved extremely attractive to the ladies and fathered 4 illegitimate children. At the same time, Ferdinand was a devout Catholic. Every morning before breakfast, he attended Mass. On Maundy Thursday, his servants would find 12 of the poorest of his subjects, so that Ferdinand could serve them supper and wash their feet, just as Jesus had done with his disciples. When Ferdinand was 5, his father, Juan II, had become king. At a very early age, Ferdinand had already shown remarkable skills in leadership and politics. By the age of 9, he had been named governor of one of his father's kingdoms. Ferdinand acted as his father's right hand in matters at home, while the king waged war against France. In 1462, civil war broke out in Aragon. merchants who disagreed with the king's politics on trade raised armies to overthrow King Juan. At the age of 12, Prince Ferdinand led royal forces in battle against these enemies of his father and won. From then on, he was the darling of Aragon, a hero who would have the full support of his people. Although Aragon participated in the fight to drive out the Moors, the kingdom was not quite so determined in this goal as Castile was. The Aragonese were a seafaring people. By the time Ferdinand became king in 1479, Aragon already possessed a Mediterranean empire that included the Balearic Islands just off the Spanish coast, as well as Sardinia and Sicily, islands off the coast of Italy. As king, Ferdinand had to not only maintain control over his territories, but also expand them. One of Ferdinand's most important advisors was Joan Margaret, the Bishop of Girona. Margaret counseled that before Aragon could be strong abroad, the kingdom had to be secure at home. The nobility in Aragon had far greater power than the crown, and as a result there was frequent warfare. In order to bring peace to the land, the bishop believed Aragon would need a strong king, one who could navigate the complex web of intrigues and power moves that riddled the nobility. It would take cunning, said the bishop. A king needed to rule with wisdom rather than with a strict moral code. A king might make promises that he need not keep. It seems that Ferdinand listened well to his teacher. In later years, he gained a reputation for cunning. Some chroniclers even called him devious. The Spanish monarch became universally recognized as a shrewd and brilliant manipulator of people in politics. The royal family. I'm gonna move this for a second. Okay. Isabel did not come easily to the throne of Castile. King Enrique was determined that his daughter, Juana, it was suspected that he was not really her father, should inherit the throne. He did everything possible to prevent first his half-brother Alfonso and then Isabel from becoming successors. The kingdom, viciously divided over the issue, erupted into civil war. After Alfonso's sudden death in 1468, he may have been murdered by one of Enrique's allies. Isabel felt that she was the natural successor to her father's throne, and she found many supporters to her claim. Isabel knew she had a better chance of becoming queen if she were married, but not to any of the suitors whom Enrique had in mind. She had secretly sent her own chaplain to look over potential husbands, always with the political future of Castile in mind. He had returned with a glowing description of Ferdinand, saying that the prince was very gallant, handsome in countenance, body, and person, and of noble air. Isabel's choice was clear. She would marry the Prince of Aragon, who was in fact a cousin. She had support from several Spanish leaders who had long hoped for an alliance between the two kingdoms. Things moved fast. Ferdinand's father, King Juan, was delighted at the match because it would greatly increase the power and wealth of Aragon. Meanwhile, Enrique forbade Prince Ferdinand, on pain of death, to set foot in Castilian soil. But nothing could stop the turn of events now. In the fall of 1469, Ferdinand left Aragon disguised as a servant and rode through the hostile countryside with a few retainers. On the night of October 14th, pro-Isabel nobles led Ferdinand to the room where she waited. She was 18, auburn-haired, with steady eyes and a regal bearing. He was 17, flaxen-haired, with sparkling eyes and a muscular body. Within 2 hours they had agreed to marry, and 4 days later the wedding took place without King Enrique. It was to prove an excellent marriage and political partnership. As Isabel developed her considerable skills in internal politics, Ferdinand was to prove a master of foreign affairs. would share equal power. What was not written in law, they would make up for through love and trust. Together they developed a motto, tanto monta, monta tanto, the one as much as the other. King Enrique died and Isabel became Queen of Castile in 1474. When Ferdinand became King of Aragon 5 years later, it was fully expected that, despite his marriage agreement, he would become the true ruler of Castile. But everyone had underestimated Isabel, for it was she who took the reins and proved herself by far the more powerful authority. Children, marriage, and power. One of the royal couple's main goals was to create and cement strong political ties to the most powerful European nations. In the tradition of European royalty, this was achieved through their children's marriages. Their first child, Isabel, was born in 1470. Ferdinand was disappointed, for he longed for a son to inherit the throne. His dream came true in 1478, when Isabel gave birth to a boy whom they named Juan. To build long-lasting ties with Austria's powerful Habsburg family, it was arranged that Juan would marry Margaret, daughter of Austria's Emperor Maximilian. 1 year later, another daughter, Juana, was born. Like Isabel's mother, this child was depressed or insane and went down in history as Juana the Mad. Nevertheless, she married Maximilian's son Philip I, and their son Charles V became ruler of the vast territories of the Holy Roman Empire. 2 more girls followed, Maria, who later became Queen of Portugal, and Catalina, who married England's King Henry VIII. In 1490, Princess Isabel married Portugal's Prince Afonso, heir to that throne. Sadly, only 6 months later, Afonso was killed in a riding accident, and young Isabel, half dead with sorrow, returned to Castile. Greater tragedies were to follow. In 1497, Prince Juan, much loved by the Castilians and well-trained to become king, died suddenly of a fever. Only a year later, the widowed Isabel, who had married again, died in childbirth. Her parents' only consolation was the fact that her son Miguel could inherit the throne. They invested all their hopes in him, but he was sickly and died at the age of 2. After all their efforts, this left Juana the Mad next in line to the throne of Spain. The Spanish Inquisition. During the Middle Ages, which is about 500 to 1500 CE, the Catholic Church, under the rule of the Pope in Rome, was a powerful force in Europe. The teachings of the Church were regarded as the foundation of law and order. Christians who did not agree with Catholic doctrine were considered heretics, and heresy was regarded as an offense against the state as well as the Church. Over the years, there were numerous occasions when the Church sought out, questioned, and punished heretics. These inquiries into a person's faith became known as the Inquisition. The goal was to educate the individual and bring them back into the fold. Usually, the inquisitors were priests or bishops who subjugated a suspect to long interrogations, followed by terrible tortures. Death by fire was often the punishment for those who did not repent. The heretic's property was then claimed by the Church. One second. Okay. I'm adjusting this here. Okay, I think that sounds better. By the time Isabel and Ferdinand came to power, that's much crisper. By the time Isabel and Ferdinand came to power, the Inquisition had especially hated those Jews who had converted to Catholicism and were known as conversos, or new Christians. Many of these conversos were wealthy and held powerful positions in court. It was said that they only pretended to be Catholics while secretly practicing Judaism, and this raised the level of mistrust against them. Anti-Semitism had flared up frequently in Spain over the centuries, and Torquemada had now fanned the flames again. To achieve religious purity, Spain had to be rid of conversos. With this goal, he persuaded the sovereigns to request that Pope Sixtus IV in Rome bring the Inquisition to Spain. Initially, Isabel was reluctant, but Ferdinand saw an opportunity to swell the royal treasury with property and money confiscated from these wealthy people, and thus the wheels of the Inquisition began to turn. Isabel appointed Torquemada as the Grand Inquisitor, and he selected 5 men to sit in judgment with him on the High Council. The High Council made all decisions concerning the Inquisition and set up several lower courts around the country. The members of the High Council developed rules to ensure that the accused received a fair trial. The accused, for example, were given the services of a lawyer, and 2 impartial priests had to be present at the trials. Wearing white robes with black hoods, the inquisitors first arrived in Seville in October 1480. Their method was to announce a pardon of 30 to 40 days, during which heretics, who had usually been denounced by other citizens, were supposed to come forward and confess. If they did, these penitents had to wear a coarse woolen robe called a San Benito, and a foolish conical hat, marking them as objects of disgust. Those who did not repent went to trial. All were assumed guilty until proven innocent. No one, rich or poor, male or female, adult or child, was spared. Immediately there were riots, and thousands of conversos and others who believed themselves in danger fled to other parts of Europe. They abandoned their properties and businesses. Soon after they left, the economy of the region began to decline. Then in January 1481, an edict was issued in Seville requiring everyone's help in the accusation and arrest of suspected heretics. To save their own lives, people accused others until there were soon thousands of victims held for trial. On January 6th, 6 men and women were burned at the stake in the first public auto de fe, or act of faith, intended to show the power of church and state and to intimidate further offenders. Over the course of 8 years in Seville alone, 700 people, mostly conversos, were burned alive, and 5,000 more were imprisoned for life. Even the bones of those long dead but suspected of heresy were dug up and publicly burned. Their children were forbidden to hold any important office, and their property was confiscated and added to the royal inventory. The pattern was repeated throughout Spain. As the Inquisition gathered momentum, it began to interfere in every aspect of daily life. People could be arrested and tried for subversive words, thoughts, and writings, for sexual misbehavior, for anything, in short, that seemed suspicious. Books that were considered heretical were banned and burned. Laws were passed called the Limpieza de Sangre, or purity of blood laws. Which forbade anyone with the slightest hint of Moorish or Jewish blood from seeking office or marrying a Christian. There were small pockets of Jewish resistance. In Aragon, an inquisitor was murdered, but the accomplices suffered such savage deaths that no one else dared to act. Soon spies were turning in evildoers to save their own lives, and fear and terror ruled the land. Worse was to come. On March 31st, 1492, the sovereign signed an edict giving all Jews in Spain 4 months to accept baptism or be expelled from the country. The Jews' attempts to buy or persuade their way out of this nightmare failed. Many, in absolute despair, accepted baptism. By August, the rest, perhaps 100,000 Jews, had fled. The Inquisition did not end there. Isabel and Ferdinand had never forgotten their pledge to rid Spain of the Muslims remaining in Granada. The Inquisition made their dream of achieving spiritual purity in Spain Muslims, who were known as Moriscos, were carefully watched to ensure that no vestige of Muslim practices remained. In 1502, Isabel did issue a decree offering a few remaining Muslims the choice between baptism or expulsion. In reality, however, Spain could not afford to lose its workforce, and few were allowed to leave. Those who could, including Boabdil, went to North Africa. In Spain, Islam was virtually stamped out. To add to the mayhem, there was an outbreak of disease on the peninsula and many people died. All these events left Spain's population decimated, its farms and cities virtually empty. The Inquisition brought all kingdoms and peoples of Spain under one yoke, but at a tremendous price. At one blow, Spain lost both Muslim and Jewish culture, talent, taxes, and business, leaving the region devastated and impoverished right into modern times. The Inquisition was to continue until the 19th century, leaving a permanent mark on Spain and its people. The New World. In the midst of these momentous events, Christopher Columbus had settled in Seville, hoping to persuade the Spanish sovereigns to finance his journey across the Atlantic. Ferdinand's attention was directed toward expanding his territories in Europe, so it was mainly Isabel who showed an interest in Columbus's ideas. Isabel, who was considered one of the most important personages in Europe, was ambitious to extend Castilian authority and Christianity farther abroad. She also recognized the need for an alternative trade route to the east, since the traditional overland routes passed through Muslim lands. Portugal had begun its rapid expansion in Africa, where it laid claim to gold, slaves, and other riches. Spain was anxious not to be left behind in the race to exploit these new worlds. Most of all, Isabel hoped that Columbus would find Prester John, the fabled Christian king who was supposed to live somewhere in the east, and who would help Christians reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem from the Muslims. Columbus's daring leap across the Atlantic Ocean in 1492 was the culmination of everything Spain had known up to that point. The Spanish loved to travel and had been expanding their territories and resettling new areas for centuries. Technology and ship design were ready for the future, and this was just one more great adventure. In Columbus's wake came thousands of colonists, most of whom were Castilians, who brought their language to the Americas. The form of government, church practices, the Inquisition, slavery, even the building of cities, which most Spaniards preferred over the countryside, and the idea of the supreme power of the monarchy were also exported to the New World. During the Reconquista, the Castilians had practiced a policy of military conquest followed by the immediate occupancy of the conquered lands by settlers. This pattern later became standard in the New World, where settlers were given land grants and native or African slaves, whom they promised to Christianize. People in Spain were fascinated by the new foods coming from the Americas, such as corn and potatoes, and by the Indians Columbus brought back with him. Yet mainly because the Spanish monarchs were in debt to European financiers, who were anxious to get back their initial investments, Spain's focus in the New World very soon became the search for precious metals. Native Americans and later Africans were ruthlessly exploited as slaves in the mines, and before long Spain was enjoying a steady flow of silver and gold in the coffers of Seville. When gold and silver deposits in one area of the Americas were exhausted, the Spanish simply conquered another. Ferdinand set up an extremely complex bureaucracy to create and maintain a monopoly over imports and exports to the Americas. Every shipload was jealously guarded, and no other nation was permitted to trade with the colonies. Ferdinand was now interested in encouraging trade and industry. His goal was solely to increase Spain would become prosperous as never before. For almost a century, its military power and tremendous wealth would give the nation a position of absolute supremacy in Europe and the territories it governed. This new wealth would trigger an explosion of learning in the arts and sciences, architecture, law, and other fields. In short, Spain would enter an era that has gone down in its history as its golden age. Despite the extraordinary wealth that poured into Spain, the Catholic monarchs' short-sighted economic planning eventually paved the way to ruin. Ferdinand and Isabel relied entirely on imports of gold and silver, rather than on trade and industry, to finance their policies. After 100 years, the mines in the Americas would run dry, and financial disaster would hit. By the end of the 16th century, Spain would begin its long decline. The end of an era. When Isabel's grandson Miguel died, Marineo Siculo, a court chronicler, wrote, "Such great grief has swept over the whole court that no one has been able to approach the queen, for the king and the queen are bowed down in deep distress." What they suffered privately, Isabel and Ferdinand hid from the public. Wars were waged, ships were sent across the far seas, and matters at home and abroad were dealt with. Yet their suffering took its toll. Isabel became ill and rolled from her bed for a few months. In 1504, she wrote her last will. She was sure of life eternal in heaven and wanted to absolve herself of all sin or blame before she got there. Among other things, money was to be given to the poor. Her debts were to be paid, and 20,000 masses were to be said. On November 26th, at the age of 53, Isabel received the last sacraments, sighed, and died peacefully. Ferdinand was distraught, and wrote that she was the best and most excellent wife that ever a king had. The sorrow of the absence of her is ripping my entrails. Despite his grief, Ferdinand married again 2 years later. He was still only the regent in Castile, but his daughter Juana was mentally ill and deemed unfit to rule. Her husband, Philip I, died in 1506. Thus Ferdinand became king of Castile, adding this to all his other titles. In the winter of 1515, Ferdinand was stricken with fever. He lost interest in politics and became severely depressed. In his last will, he requested that he lie next to Isabel in the cathedral at Granada, as they had both desired. Ferdinand died on January 23rd, 1516, aged 64, leaving behind a vast empire to his grandson, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Evaluating Isabel and Ferdinand. In order to understand Isabel and Ferdinand, a modern reader must try to place them firmly in their times. Today we value tolerance of other people's viewpoints and religious beliefs. We do not try to make everyone conform to a single standard of beliefs and behavior. In Isabel and Ferdinand's times, religion was a powerful, unifying force. For hundreds of years, the Catholic Church in Rome had ruled Europe, bringing order to the continent after the chaos that followed the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. Both monarchs believed in John the Evangelist's New Testament prophecy that God planned to bring the world to an end. It would be renewed, he said, by a warrior king or Messiah who would usher in a golden age of peace. Isabel and Ferdinand believed that this king would be chosen by God from their own royal family, and that, in order to fulfill the prophecy, the Spanish race had to be pure. Thus, in their eyes, God would favor the expulsion of such unclean elements as Jews and Muslims. God would also support Christian efforts to conquer and convert non-Christians, no matter how brutally these victories were won. Although Isabel and Ferdinand often caused great suffering, they almost always had good intentions and firmly believed that they were acting in the best interests of their subjects and their realm. Their actions were not only accepted but lauded by other European rulers. In fact, some historians now maintain that our information on the Inquisition is exaggerated based on propaganda written around 1567 by anti-Catholic Protestants. aristocracy and thus of the Cortes. Funds allocated by the Cortes were raised from taxes. Since the nobility and the clergy did not have to pay taxes, they often had little interest in attending the meetings. The sovereigns cleverly used the absence of these officials to undermine their authority. Another strategy was to convene sessions at the monarch's own whim, usually when they desperately needed money for war or other expensive projects. The rest of the time, they tended to ignore this great institution, once even allowing a gap of 16 years without a meeting. To further cement the crown's power, the monarchs entirely reorganized the government so that it worked more closely through their royal authority. Their main tools were royal councils, which were in attendance at court throughout the year. These were the councils of state, justice, finances, the Inquisition, the military, the Indies, and the Hermandad. This last council gave the monarchs control over the towns. They also won control over the church by winning from the Pope the right to select church authorities. In Aragon, each of the kingdom's highly independent provinces were administered by its own Cortes, since it was considered impossible for the king to rule such a diverse empire. While the landowners in Aragon were wealthy and powerful, the real masters of the kingdom were the merchants and businessmen who dominated economic life. They arranged a contract between the king and his subjects and added a fourth estate to their Cortes, that of ordinary gentlemen, which gave the people greater representation. They won legislation requiring that laws could only be made or repealed by mutual consent of the king and the Cortes. For this reason, Ferdinand avoided the Cortes as often as possible. He knew, for example, that the members of the institution might not award him funds for his various wars, so he would raise soldiers through his own means and then saddle the kingdom with the cost of their support. Eventually, however, despite its strong resistance, even the Aragonese Cortes buckled before royal power. In the end, Isabel and Ferdinand united the various kingdoms of Spain by ruthlessly insisting on the supreme power of the crown, which held authority above all other institutions. They created order where once chaos had existed, and unity where discord had been the rule. But the people of Spain lost much of their liberty and potentially powerful democratic institution when the Cortes lost its authority. Education. In the 1470s, the printing press with movable type, which had been invented in Germany, was introduced in Spain. Before, books and papers had been copied by hand, a very time-consuming and expensive process. While a scribe could perhaps complete one handwritten copy of a book in a year, a printer could turn out 1,000 copies of the same book in the same amount of time. Excited about this breakthrough in technology, Isabel and Ferdinand passed a new law that allowed the tax-free importation of foreign books. At the same time, Latin, the language of only the learned in society, was given way to Castilian, the everyday language of the people. Isabel commissioned Antonio de Nebrija to compile the first Latin-Spanish dictionary, which was completed in 1492. The impact of these new developments was enormous. Now those who could read had access to the ideas of poets, philosophers, doctors, and scientists from other countries. The world was opening up, and Spain was an eager student. Isabel and Ferdinand set the stage for a great flowering of culture and learning. With the monarch's support, old universities like those in Salamanca and Valladolid gained new energy, while more than 30 new universities sprang up in other towns. Salamanca accepted both men and women, rich and poor, and there were even some female professors. It was here that Columbus revealed the secrets of the New World. Here, medical students were allowed to dissect the human body, which was forbidden almost everywhere else. Copernicus's discovery that the planets revolve around the sun was taught at Salamanca, sense. Advanced Spanish ship design and map making took explorers to the far corners of the earth. Great thinkers produced major works on philosophy, religion, economics, and political theory. Historians found more scientific ways of looking at the past, and Spanish authors were recognized as authorities on medicine, navigation, mining, metallurgy, and mineralogy. New forms of literature burst onto the market, paving the way for geniuses such as Cervantes, the author of the famous novel Don Quixote, and Lope de Vega, Spain's greatest dramatist. By the mid-16th century, Spain was considered the center of learning in Europe. The Spanish Conquistador. Spain could not have won its global territories without its soldiers, known as conquistadores or conquerors. The conquistadors were men of iron. It was said that they could win any trial of endurance and were almost never defeated in battle. There were many reasons for this reputation. First of all, Spain's rough terrain and uncomfortable climate, with freezing winters and blazing summers, bred hardy men who were not bothered by extremes of heat and cold. They rarely became sick. While French soldiers died by the thousands in America's malaria-ridden swamps, the Spaniards barely noticed. Okay, side note. When I first read this, I texted one of my friends who is a doctor and specializes in, well, she's a doctor, but she likes to research medical history in her spare time, kind of like how I do geography in my spare time. So I texted her this line and said, "Is this true?" And she was like, "No." So take with that what you will. She was like, "The Spanish died of malaria too." So, moving on. The Spanish soldier was not very interested in excesses of food and drink and could easily survive on the bare minimum. He also reacted less emotionally than his French or Italian counterparts in victory or defeat. The conquistador is often a seafaring man and may have journeyed north to England and the Netherlands, or east across the Mediterranean, or with any of the great explorers to the Americas or the farther regions of Africa. So he was used to new sights and could quite easily adapt to new ways of life. Religious faith was his driving force, and the hopes of becoming wealthy from the spoils of war. In attaining these goals, he possessed an unparalleled discipline. Because of the long struggle against the Moors, the Spanish were raised from childhood to honor and admire the exploits of their forefathers in battle. Fed a constant diet of stories about chivalrous knights and brave warriors, they grew up already ambitious to prove their strength, their loyalty, and their manliness on the battlefield. To die defending Spain and its sovereigns was considered a great honor. Architecture and design. The majority of people on the Iberian Peninsula lived in towns and simple houses built of packed mud, which were often washed away in heavy rains. The streets were rough paths with no paving. In the winter, they became muddy sewers. In the summer, people moved in a cloud of dust. Only the great castles and churches stood aloof in all their stony grandeur, built to last forever. Before the reign of Isabel and Ferdinand, the Moors had had the greatest influence on Spanish architecture. They loved ornate carving and colorful tiles decorated with complex patterns. Their houses boasted intricate woodwork, balconies, and thick walls that kept rooms cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Ceilings were painted or carved, and magnificent archways led from one room to another. The Moors also created beautiful gardens, often irrigated with pools, fountains, and waterfalls, which were havens of peace in a rugged countryside. Where Christians surrounded themselves with religious images and statuary, Muslim law forbade any replication of Allah, the Arabic name for God. Thus, Muslims became masters of purely decorative design, using flowers, animals, birds, and geometric patterns to enhance their surroundings. Isabel and Ferdinand stamped their reign with a new kind of architecture. Before their time, churches and cathedrals were rather severe in design, with little ornamentation. Isabel encouraged artisans to give free rein to their imagination, and a new style called Isabelline began to emerge. Flowers, fruit, foliage, animals, and imaginary creatures covered every available inch of stone on the facades of buildings. house in Seville, which had been under construction for centuries, were pushed to completion. Many other projects celebrated military victories or simply the great power and self-confidence of the sovereigns. During Enrique IV's reign, chaos had ruled the provinces of Spain, and art was far from anyone's mind. But in the new era, it was as though the creative spirit of the Spaniards, especially the Castilians, had been repressed for centuries and suddenly came to life. Just as architecture now flourished, so did sculpture. Artists worked in marble, alabaster, and rare metals, taking sculpture to new heights. They knew how to make such hard materials resemble lace and velvet, and they duplicated every detail of clothing, jewelry, and hair with incredible skill. Isabel employed the sculptor Gilles de Siloy, I'm not sure how to say that at all, to build the stone mausoleum or tomb of her father, mother, and younger brother. Other artists such as Felipe de Borgona and Alonso Berruguete were equally skilled with wood and carved church pews and choir stalls. Some of these works are considered among the finest of their kind in the world. Food and lodging. Many accounts report on the dismal conditions facing the traveler through 15th century Spain. Robert Gauguin was a French priest employed on diplomatic missions between France and Spain. He wrote that most rooms were of mud, often infested with lice and other vermin. A traveler was provided with a clay dish, but had to find his own food and serve it up himself. Gauguin had to gather his own firewood and clean out the cooking pots used. He also had to purchase hay and oats for his mule and tend to the animal himself. On top of all this, an innkeeper could charge whatever he wanted, and prices were often exorbitant. Ferdinand and Isabel introduced some reforms in this area, ordering innkeepers to post signs stating current prices and the tips due to servants. The Spaniards were somewhat Spartan in their tastes, including their taste in food. Princess Juana's husband, Philip I, came from the Low Countries. When he introduced the long and elaborate dinners and drinking habits of the North to the Spanish court, many witnesses were shocked and frowned on such excesses. Francisco Villalobos, Ferdinand's personal physician, was concerned for people's health and wrote, "For myself, I prefer a pot full of garlic seasoned with olive oil, and cabbages that issue from the pot exhaling savory vapors, and laborer's bread that fills one's whole mouth, and not some hollow stuff made only to please the palate." Probably most Spaniards of the time would have agreed with him. Festivals and fiestas. During the time of Isabel and Ferdinand, Spaniards enjoyed many fiestas, celebrations that marked Christian holy days, saints' days, and seasonal changes. Each town and village had its own distinctive festivals organized by brotherhoods called cofradias. Many of these festivals are still celebrated today. Some were a curious blend of ancient pagan practices and Christian beliefs. Everywhere in Spain, the Christmas season was the occasion to celebrate nativity plays. For elaborate nativity plays, which often included real shepherds and live sheep. In the village of La Soca, in the kingdom of Navarre in northern Spain, the people celebrated by remembering the story of the charcoal burner. He was the person who came down from the mountains to tell the people the good news of Christ's birth. In the fiesta celebrating this event, a villager would be carried shoulder high through the town on Christmas Eve. One of the most exciting times of year was the period just before Lent. A carnival atmosphere would take hold just before the season of repentance. Authorities, such as the mayor of a town, would be mocked by children, and streets would be filled with revelers wearing huge masks and dancing to music. Freaks, fools, monsters, devils, all kinds of creatures would be represented. Mary Magdalene, a follower of Jesus, was a popular figure in Spain. To honor her, the men of the mountain village of Anguiano developed a special tradition of dancing on stilts. During this July fiesta, the dancers wore long skirts that swirled out as they spun on their stilts, negotiating the steep streets almost in a trance. Their faith in the Magdalena promised them a safe journey to her shrine. centuries mention the San Fermines that took place during October in Pamplona and Navarre. They were a combination of religious and commercial celebrations to promote trade, and included processions, dancing, and the display of livestock. A tradition developed in which dangerous bulls were let loose in the streets, and daring young men risked their lives to race ahead of them, hoping to reach the bull ring where the bullfight would take place alive. In Spain, bulls were and still are often at the heart of many festivals, perhaps because in pagan times they were sacrificed to various gods. They also represent the Spanish ideals of courage and daring. The fall was a quieter period in Spain, and festivals often reflected the need to prepare for the coming winter. Thus, many fiestas featured the slaughter of animals for meat and the end of the harvest season. Feasts included traditional foods such as roscos or cookies, panes or sweet rolls, tostones or codfish, and roasted chestnuts known as magostos. All over Spain, at various times of the year, people reenacted the defeat of the Moors in annual festivals, riding on horseback or on mules. Spaniards representing Christians and Moors would engage in mock battles. Of course, the followers of the cross always triumphed, while the Moors were always banished. And that's actually going to be the end. We're going to skip this last chapter because it's mostly just a bunch of quotes.